So just to give you a little bit of context, I know we're this conference is a New Jersey conference, but for those who don't know, Rowan is located in Glassboro, New Jersey. We started in 1923 as a normal school. I was in fact a student when it was Glassboro State, but not in the 20s, a little later. We became Rowan University after Henry Rowan endowed $100 million. And so they later changed the name to Rowan University. We have just under 20, and maybe a little higher now that I think about it, students. And in our teacher education program, we are just under 3,000 teacher candidates. Our presentation will be guided by two questions that are presented on the slide. We're very interested in working with colleges within and outside the College of Education to increase students' test scores. And secondly, knowing that the College of Education focuses on the pedagogy and our colleges outside the College of Ed focuses on content, we wanted to know how might we work together to ensure our College of Education students were successful at passing the Praxis exam. To give you some information about this group, the Teacher Education Advisory Council, or TEAC for short, is the governance body for teacher ed. We meet 4 times a year, twice in the fall, twice in the spring, with all the college's faculty who work with teacher education candidates. The council and these meetings were designed with the goal of engaging, or I should say is designed with the goal of engaging in continuous improvement efforts. So for this year, our first meeting was in October, and the council met and reviewed our goals and objectives for the year. I am actually the chairperson for TEAC, and so at our October meeting, really at all our meetings, I defined the council's role in the accreditation process because we are going through an accreditation year. The College of Ed's Cape visit will take place in spring 2022. So at our October meeting, we talked about the data that TEAC might find helpful to inform our efforts for continuous improvement. And finally, we discussed how the multiple colleges might work together in order to analyze data so our students in the College of Ed could meet transition point 2, which is the passing of Praxis 2. So we approached the data review in 4 phases, which are listed on the slide, and I'm going to very quickly summarize each of the stages so that my colleagues can really talk about their work. So like I said before, Praxis 2 is a transition point that candidates must pass to continue through the college's program. And in order to set the stage, prior to the completion of the academic year, each program in the College of Ed is charged with holding a data retreat. And the retreat is used to assess the progress of our candidates. The Praxis 2 reports that we supply to programs include a summary of the results. And the hope is more meaningful analysis by reviewing the range and average number of test takers' attempts. After reviewing Praxis 2 scores for the 3 previous completed academic years, faculty were asked to dig deeper. And what I mean by this is the data indicated that our candidates struggled with specific content tests consistently. And so this chart shows the Praxis 2 tests that have under a 50% first time passing rate. For the digging even deeper phase, we shared with TEAC faculty and the programs with the number of maxed out attempts, meaning 5 or more attempts, in order to begin a discussion about how might we work together to rethink curriculum and address some missing links around content knowledge. And then in the final phase of digging even deeper, TEAC faculty left the October meeting with a handout, and a timeline to guide the use of the data provided in the summary reports. They also had an assignment to develop and sign up to present short presentations that they would share at the remaining TAC meetings. And what is shown on this slide is the content for this handout. And what you'll see are the instructions and the due dates that my colleagues use to present the presentation for today's conference. And so now I am hoping that Jane and Jean are able to present their presentation. Jane, Jean, are you there?
Yes, Stacey,
Okay.
can you hear me okay or no?
We can hear you. That's what's important. Just tell me when
Jane, can you hear?
Yep, Jean, we can hear you too.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. We had some technical problems, both of us, for some reason. But we're
great. Okay, there's your first slide.
Can you hear me?
Uh-oh. Jean, can you hear us? No? Okay.
No.
All right.
Cutting in and out.
Oh, all right. I'll pick up for Jean and keep going. If your audio improves, jump in when you can. So for art education at Rowan University, we have a dual degree program. Our students receive both a BA in education and a BA in art, or they may receive the Bachelor of Fine Arts with New Jersey Certificate of Eligibility with Advanced Standing for visual art, grades K through 12. The art education program at Rowan is also accredited by the National Association of Schools of Art and Design through the Department of Art. So Dr. and I straddle two different colleges, two different departments, and it works. Fortunately, it works. Next slide. So our students need to take the art content knowledge practice, and they need to meet a minimum passing score of 158 for entry into the year-long professional year. Uh-oh, our slides are moving. Okay, next slide. This is the art content knowledge praxis exam at a glance, just to give you an idea of what the test looks like. It's a 2-hour-long test. Students need to answer about 120 questions. They are selected response questions, but it's quite a breadth of knowledge that they need to have to go into this exam. And it covers questions on the art making processes, the media and the processes. And then they also need to have a broad knowledge and understanding of the historical and theoretical foundations of art. So that includes the materials and processes in art in an historical context, the Western tradition in art history, art beyond the Western tradition, and they need to be able to answer questions having to do with responding to art. Okay, next slide. So we asked ourselves, and we ask all the time, how are you studying for the practice? Most often they have told us that they use the companion guides that ETS offers. They also use the video library, and probably most often used are the Quizlets, which are practice test questions. They also purchase or rent books. There's the two that are most often used and has been for years is Teacher's Book of Lists and the Annotated Mona Lisa. And I have learned from them. They are in the practice of making a lot of their own flashcards. Our students take 3 art history courses. One is a survey 1 course, which covers from prehistory. I think it goes up to the Renaissance, and then they take an art history 2 that goes from the Renaissance up to modern day. And then they have an option to take a 3rd that they have choices that focus on American art or women's history, women's art history, and art criticism courses. Next slide. So Dr. Neglia and I looked at, beginning with 2014 to 2020, actually, looking at the scoring data for Praxis. And generally, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but found that only 50% of our students are passing on the first attempt. So next slide. And this states more years. Next slide. So I started to think back, because I fortunately have the years under my belt. I remember a time when students passed on the first try. I would have the rare student come into my office who was struggling with passing the exam. And so I looked at this and I thought, well, there's something happened. Something must have happened. I think it was back in around 2010, Praxis did change the exam. And unfortunately, they didn't post practice tests based on the new exam. And I remember this very well, because about 9 students showed up in my office who were very upset because they didn't pass the Praxis 2. And I thought it odd at the time. And they said that Praxis didn't post, didn't update the practice. So they studied based on the old exam format. And it really threw them off. Unfortunately, the College of Ed saw that as, a glitch, and extended deadline for them. And they all retook the exam and they all passed. And that was the only time I remember hitting a large number of students who had to retake this exam. So when I looked at the current numbers from 2014 on, I'm saying to myself, wow, well, something else must have happened here. Next slide. So I went back to the 2010, 2011, because prior to that, I knew that most of them had been passing that exam first try. And I did some of the number crunching, and I saw this downward trend happen, which really concerned me. And of course, there are a lot of variables involved. Every class of students that enter the program are different from the previous year, but consistency of passing for so many years, and then all of a sudden, things shifted. Next slide. So what changed? So in 2009, the New Jersey Department of Education revised the requirements for the certificate. They went from requiring 12 credit intro level studios to 12 credits intermediate to advanced level studios. So what that meant for the students was that instead of having this broad range of studio experience, they had to choose a studio, whether they chose painting or they chose ceramics or something else. They started taking classes in that studio that were very focused. So consequently, left all the other studio areas their experiences. Next slide. So Dr. Neglia and I are trying to think this through. What are we going to do? the program has changed because of the requirements by the state certificate, and we can't flip that back. So we started thinking that maybe what we could do is to propose one course, a new course that gave them that breadth of knowledge covering all the studios, with all the vocabulary terms and connecting to the art history components. And so that's something that's the other idea we had, was to take the current method courses that we have and perhaps change them, change some of the content or add content to it that's going to cover all that there. But I think that might be hard to do, but we're gonna flesh that out over the summer. I know that we can start to put together a study guide for the students, and that's certainly easier to do, to tap the studio faculty and ask them to contribute to that. So I definitely think that's one thing we're going to work on over the summer. And then we thought that possibly we could create formal study groups for the students to help them along. And that we'll just keep thinking this through. So thank you. And if there's questions, I guess the chat's the way to go. And I'll pass that on to Vanessa.
So much, Jane. Good morning again. So coming to you from music education, I'll also give you kind of a lay of the land similar to our art program. In music education, you are earning a Bachelor of Music in Music Education and a Bachelor of Arts in Education. So it is a dual degree program. And for our test, you can see the content here made up primarily of musical content knowledge in regard to history, theory, and performance. That fourth section there gets a little bit to pedagogical issues where students would need to kind of diagnose some things that might be occurring musically within the classroom. And you need to earn a 153 in order to pass. Dr. Leftwich, if you would click and click. And you can just see some examples here. We do have to look at notation in order to analyze it, or to see something like a conducting pattern and what would be appropriate. Making those connections. Click again, please. And one more time for me. Thanks. And then we also have within this test a component of 30 minutes for a significant listening portion. So you would hear something like this.
The progression will now be played for the first time.
And need to be analyzing that by ear in order to say what the chord progression is. So that's an additional component. Then you need to get through 90 questions in 85 minutes. So we know that there's a lot to work through in this particular exam. Clicking to the next slide, please. So in general, we're happy to report that we're doing well. Within this 3-year period, this window, we had 111 students take the exam and 101 passed on the first time. So you can see that larger percentage of 91 are the students that passed on that first time, and 4 passed on the second try, 2 passed on the third, and then we had 4 that passed on more than 3 tries. Of those students, those 10 students that did not pass on the first try, it was 5 who identified as female, 5 who identified as male, and the ratios kind of pass to not passing. There were 2 students who did not pass, BIPOC students, and then 8 white students who did not pass out of 90. So if we look at that percentage-wise, there's some similar percentages happening. Let's click to the next slide, please. Thank you, and click one more time for me. So possible explanations for this, we can see for the most part we're doing well, but there are some years where there ends up being a couple of a higher group of students that did not pass. We've had pretty significant changes in our faculty in terms of turnover in the kind of past 4 or 5 years. And so we're wondering if that might be some connection. Our curriculum, unlike art, has stayed pretty stable during that time frame. So we're just wondering if some things were kind of lost as there was more transition happening within our faculty structure. And click again, please. So pretty short on the data front, because on the whole, we're doing well and we're pleased with that. If if you would click for a couple of bullet points, thanks so much. In general, the majority of students seem to be getting what they need. They go through a significant number of history and theory classes within their first 2 years, and since the majority of questions are living in that zone, it seems to be matching the work that needs to be done. There are, we have data to support kind of nationally that the Praxis 2 and specifically this ELPIS reference is in connection to the music praxis. We do see bias in the exam. Happily, however, that bias, you know, we have white candidates earn significantly higher scores in the Praxis 2 than Black candidates, and male score significantly higher than female candidates. We have proportional figures between white and students of color and male and female. So that's something we're able to, again, be pleased about. For those who aren't passing the first time, however, the majority of them are looking at 3 or more. So we need to reach out to these students and strive to provide them with some additional resources or make sure that they're taking advantage of the resources that Rowan provides. We won't click out to it, but I was able to look at other universities and see that some of them have websites specifically targeting this music praxis. So we've been kind of distributing that information. In addition, we have a Praxis lab on Rowan's campus for Praxis Core. We don't have a Praxis lab for any Praxis 2 exams, but we do have a student organization that has a collegiate chapter of the National Association for Music Education. And that student-run group, we're looking into kind of running a Praxis 2 lab to keep those elements in-house and hopefully to empower some of our upperclassmen who've been successful taking that exam to provide some support for students who are younger in the program. Last but not least, it's just another reminder that students of color are minoritized in the field of music education and that we need to consider or to continue to consider pipeline programs that address these issues. And we're actually piloting a program that's kind of within our community music school and looking at that as a pathway specifically to the community of Bridgerton into our program. So although we're happy with how we're doing on Praxis, again, just kind of reviewing this data is, again, drawing our attention to some more systemic issues within our field and within our program in particular. Thanks so much.
Glad to be here today, talk about how the history department in particular can improve our approach to the Praxis, particularly the social studies practice. So as I mentioned, I am the coordinator of the American Studies program. A lot of our education majors have a dual major in American Studies. I also teach in the history department, which of course, you know, teaches a lot of the history content. Next slide, please. So the challenge here is, you know, what can the history department in particular do? American Studies doesn't, you know, teach a lot of content courses. We're an interdisciplinary major, so it's, you know, a lot of different departments there. Next slide. So I have a sample social studies Praxis showing some of the history questions here. I realize these are not readable for most people, very, very small. I'll read you out one on the left side here. So let me tell you first what some of the social studies history questions are like. They're a combination of, you know, history questions from American and world history. The questions are sort of all over the place in terms of what they ask. Some are pretty basic level. So question number 1 asks about to whom did the Emancipation Proclamation initially apply? Did it apply to those enslaved people living in the areas still in rebellion, those who were serving in the Union armies, those who were living in the border states, or those who had escaped to northern states? So students have to choose between those. The next one asks about when did United States escalation in Vietnam officially begin, right? So more or less kind of factual survey level history information. Other questions are much more highly specific or interpretive. So question 24 gives students a quotation, an unattributed, you know, quotation about, I counted 7 ministers all preaching at once. The people were singing and praying and crying. And then the students have to determine whether that quotation applies to a meeting of Pennsylvania Quakers during the Revolution, a frontier camp meeting during the Second Great Awakening, a presentation during the Chautauqua Assembly, or a convention of the Women's Christian Temperance Association. So students have to be able to, ID all 4 of those 19th century social history, social and cultural history, terms to be able to kind of choose between them. So all this information theoretically is covered in college level history surveys, right? It's not out of the question that students, will receive this information. In practice, how Rowan education majors get this information, there's a lot of variance in how they're actually, being taught this information and when and where they're accessing it. So we can go to the next slide. So where do Rowan students acquire US and world history content? A lot of our students take this content elsewhere, not at Rowan. Many of them, of course, try to get this course content before they come to Rowan. They've taken US history through AP courses in high school, in order to get those college credits out of the way. Many of our students are transfer students, and so they've taken US history surveys or world history surveys or Western Civ surveys at community colleges because it's a much less expensive option. And so they get that out of the way before they transfer to Rowan. And again, those, that's not something that we at Rowan, have control over. We don't, we can't, say anything about what kind of, classes they're getting at other places if, we're not teaching the classes. When they take surveys at Rowan, they usually take the world history survey because that's one that community colleges are less likely to offer. Native students, meaning non-transfer students, are required to, many of the different program requirements require them to take a history course, but they don't always specify which one. So students aren't always required to take the survey course, first of all. For instance, American Studies majors are not necessarily required to take both halves of the US history survey. They might have the first half of the survey, i.e. up to 1865, and then they will take an upper level history course to fulfill the rest of their history requirement. And that's, great for a lot of reasons. Upper level history courses are more engaging. They don't feel as though this is things they have taken in high school. It's a more interesting content. It's a more, intellectual in a lot of ways. But the upper level courses are less focused on content acquisition. To give an example, Dr. Bill Kerrigan teaches a course on the Civil War and Reconstruction. And in that course, he's going to talk a lot about the war, obviously. He's going to talk a lot about post-war Black civil rights. He's going to talk about the evolving concept of Black personhood. He's going to talk a lot about violence because lynching is actually a scholarly interest of his. He's going to go to depth on a lot of topics. The students are going to read historical monographs. But a student could easily leave that course without maybe fixing on that one point of who did the Emancipation Proclamation cover? That's kind of a minor point in a way because it's just a moment during the war and it's, I can see missing that point, right? So how to get students to, to have covered these sort of factual points at the point when they take the Praxis exam. And I should have mentioned an earlier point, from the history department's perspective, there's a little bit of blindness to this because history education majors, on whom history faculty tend to be most focused on history education majors tend to do pretty well in the Praxis because they're on the social studies Praxis, because this is their interest. They themselves are history majors. They are keen to read the subject, and so they have a native interest in it. Other students in other majors, education, American Studies majors, other dual majors, don't necessarily have that drive to be interested in the topic. So I think one of the major difficulties we have is that students, when they come to take the Praxis, they did learn these things, but it might have been 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 years ago. One point that became clear to me, and this is, one of those points where you realize, that time has changed since you were in college, is that students don't keep their textbooks today. They rent them, or if they buy them, a hard copy, they resell them, which means that they don't have them to study with, so they don't have, a textbook on their shelf that they can turn to from when they took the survey 2 and 3 and 4 years ago, that they can just sort of, have a refresher when it's time to take the social studies practice. They don't have that in front of them. And as I mentioned, the most recent courses that they've taken have given them, hopefully a much more in-depth study of history, but sometimes just, taking an in-depth history course is a very inefficient way to learn 4 facts about US history, that you'll be asked on this Praxis. So some suggestions that I had offered, one is to generate and maintain a list of courses that are useful for this content. Excuse me. Can I go back to the last slide? Thank you. So in addition to history courses, actually the poli-sci and sociology courses are particularly useful. And those history courses that focus on legal and constitutional history turn out to be particularly useful, because a lot of the questions that are asked tend to be sort of focused on legislative type history. What was the legal ramification? Those first 2 questions, one of the questions I mentioned about, the specifics of the Emancipation Proclamation. The next question was, what was the official, U.S. entry into Vietnam? Those are very sort of, textbooky, what with the specific date detail kind of thing. Legal and constitutional history is a great way to focus and memorize those sort of things, whereas an upper level history class is going to focus on gender studies and social history and, justice issues, which are very, very important, I think, for making citizens, but is going to be less helpful in this exam where you have to answer these very specific questions. Encourage faculty to make connections as to, how their classes are useful for the Praxis, which I think will be difficult. Try to make connections between the history department and the education department to try to, help students, make this connection. And also encourage students to really, think actively from the beginning of their, education career is, I'm going to have to take this test, keep these surveys, keep these textbooks, think about direct tutoring, because, as it is the model of history education and the way the Praxis, the kind of things the Praxis asked about are frankly not the kind of history that, we're teaching, and is honestly not a useful way of thinking about history, and we're not going to teach history in order to answer, trivia questions, which is, to be honest, kind of what the Praxis is sort of asking. But, tutoring and reviewing and more survey, focusing on the surveys is, I think, the most useful approach for that.
Thank you, Katie and Vanessa. I think Erica is having some issues on her end. She's not seeing her slides. So Erica, what I can do is you can just tell me to move on and I can.
Well, yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me at least?
I can hear you, and we're on your intro slide. So just tell me to move forward.
All right, wonderful. So yeah, I'm actually stuck at the art education at Rowan University, and I just thought maybe, I don't know, but I can manage. So you so much to my colleagues who have gone before me to talk about this really important subject of Praxis 2 and how we support our students and how we also make curriculum decisions. So I think I can remember what it looks like, but I was thinking about the last conversation.
I'm just going to jump in real quick. Karen, how much time do we have? I want to make sure that we have time for questions.
All right, I got like 5 minutes maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you would, I'm sorry, but if you could limit it to 5 minutes, that would be great, because I think there probably are many questions to ask about your presentation.
I'll keep it very simple. I am the program coordinator for the Elementary Education Studies program here at Rowan, and it's also a dual degree program that combines the BA in education with the BA in a second dual major. About 2 semesters ago, we implemented the elementary only option as well. With the dual degree major, there are 10 subject matters that are encompassed in that. And I have it listed on the slide, so you can read through that very quickly. Stacey, if you go to the next slide. So in the elementary education program, our candidates are required to meet a minimum score on the following examinations. So they have the gift of having to take 4 exams. So right off the bat, there is, I won't say inequities, but this is part of what an elementary educator has to prepare for being a generalist. So they have to have the content knowledge in reading and language arts and mathematics and social studies and science. So the average score, you can see, ranges between a 157, 155 and a 159. And the number of average tests taken by each student varies between 1 and 2 tests to pass, to pass the actual test. When you look at the next slide, Stacey, here at a glance, again, this kind of outlines the total number of questions for each test. And it's a lengthy test, so there's probably over 200 questions students need to prepare for. So students need to be really strategic in terms of how they're preparing for the test, and also we need to support them in getting them through this particular test. The test questions focus on knowledge, again, in the 4 major content areas, and they're tested in multiple ways in terms of they're looking at the conceptual understanding of elementary ed topics, the procedural awareness, interpretation, the integration and the application of these said subjects. The test is aligned to the Common Core standards for English language arts and mathematics, as well as the social studies content standards. And the development of the science test comes from the National Science Education Standards and the National Science Teacher Association standards. So for the first few years of our education program, usually our general ed students' requirements are based in foundational teaching courses, which are taught outside of the College of Education. And then the last couple years from junior on, the courses are more pedagogically approached, and they are also practicing the application when they're in the clinician in the field experiences. So Stacey, if you move forward, I think this is suggestions for programming. Am I there yet? Okay, good. So ideas for strengthening the infrastructure of supports for our programming. We came up with just some really intentional ways to engage our students. So thinking about from the time they enter and they come for orientation, we want to really talk about thinking about taking that test sooner while the information is as fresh as it possibly be leaving out of high school and coming into college. We also want to talk about like a guided admissions process, which helps identify candidates' educational profile and seeing where there might have been strengths and weaknesses in their P12 work. Well, not as far as P12, but in their high school work, so that we can, again, begin to support them. And then also to help undergraduates understand their course requirements that align with what elementary teachers need to know. So really honing in on the fact that you are going to be a generalist. I used to use this term when I was in the field. I was a jack of all trades and a master of none. I had to know everything, but it's important that you really need to be thinking with a broader view. And then again, getting Praxis ready when you come to the undergraduate open house. And then one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about was our partnership that we have with some local organizations like the Camden Pipeline Initiative. I work with some wonderful folks, and I know that when our teachers sign up for their program, they also support us in teaching teacher education and Praxis 2 preparation. So if there's a student who has not met that benchmark at a certain time, they will provide tutoring and resources to help students kind of get over that hurdle. And then I call this thing called a markers, just kind of helping students keep track of their academic profile and where they should be. So kind of embedding it within our curriculum program, saying here, at this point in time, you should be thinking about taking this test, and here are the supports that you would need. So really just out that process for them and what it looks like. Stacey, if you go to the next slide, I think it's suggestions for students. Am I good? Okay. And then to support students, again, with stronger outcomes, we suggest helping them really develop a study plan. As part of the collegiate experience, you have to devote some time to actually practicing this work and making sense of it on your own. So defining the content area, determining strengths and weaknesses in the content area, identifying resources, and then committing to a study plan. Also curating your resources. As I heard before, many students, they may rent a book or they may sell the book at the end, but you can maybe think about a way of capturing your notes and kind of doing a really good job of keeping that and using it. I do it as a current student here. Also, there is a wonderful resource that I had a chance to kind of vet and play around with, but Rowan University has EBSCO Learning Express, which offers free practice exams and also the actual study guide. If you download any individual study guide, it's probably at least 280 pages of study content. So these are free resources that are not well known, I think, and we need to promote that so our students have access. And then also the ETS video library for test preparation. I mean, it's okay for me to talk about these things, but I think to be a part of this process, I too, as a coordinator, should make sure that I understand what it looks like and I can vet through any potential pitfalls or anything that's going to belabor the process, but I want to go through the experience with my students. So I'm going through and making sure that these are applicable and these are going to work and help them. And then, the last case scenario I would say is price test preparation. I think there are many free resources available, but if it takes that, it's okay for someone to go down that path. So those are my suggestions for students. And I think the last slide was just a slide that talks about the percentage of our students passing over time. And I don't remember what the charts are, but again, I think we had a pass rate after 1 or 2 tries. I will say that social studies and science are some of the content tests that seem to students struggle with more. So they need a little bit more support in that area where you might see them taking that test 2 or 3 times. I think that's it. Thank you so much for your time. And I think I got under 5 minutes.
You did, Erica. And that was actually, I think, one of the questions that's in the chat. So I think you actually answered it. But Karen, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yes, thank you. Kathy did ask the question, with 4 tests that these students have to take, are there certain tests that students struggle with more with than others?
And thank you for the question. Yes, of the 4, the higher numbers of taking the test more than once, we've seen it in social studies subset tests and the science subset test. Now, the social studies test is actually the one that seems to be the most difficult of all the tests, and it also has the lowest passing score. So we really need to take a look at it. And I think it goes to the conversation earlier where we're no longer generalists, but students have the opportunity to really go and promote individualized interests, and they develop a really specific set of skills and learning about historical context. And sometimes they go in so deep that they kind of go past the foundational stuff. And I think that's what you were saying, Katherine. If they go deep and wide and kind of miss the cursory stuff that they need for this test.
And Kathy mentions, she responds, yes, same here. And I will endorse that also, same here. And I do think it goes back to what Katherine has said, that the test addresses trivia type knowledge when our students are more embedded in historical thinking. And so I think that might be part of the problem. Jennifer asks, do students struggle with the math praxis?
I guess I can answer that. So surprisingly so, I think because taking the math praxis is conceptual and procedural and fluency that it's a little bit more, I think, easier for students to navigate that test. I don't see, the average test time is 1.2. So maybe they take the test a second time, but it's not certainly nearly as challenging as, for some reason, like I said, the social studies test, which is still mind-boggling to me. But they do pretty okay in the social studies. They get mathematics. The average test is 157 in terms of the score.
Okay. And Jennifer goes on to say, does the program sequence have 1 or 2 semesters of math methods courses?
Eric, I think that's another one.
So our program sequence, pre-professional, there is a mathematics course. And then when they're in a professional track, there is a math strategies course that students take. So they do have mathematics at least twice in our program.
Okay. I think you answered Jennifer's next question then. And Katherine, you have written here, one of my colleagues, an expert in Islamic history, said that she was unsure about one of the questions on Islamic history. It was vaguely written and weirdly framed.
After seeing my presentation last time, she said, I couldn't answer that question. That's a weird, unanswerable question. The question is,
Yeah.
in which of the following fields did Islamic civilization most influence Europeans? Music, theology, mathematics, or law? Most?
Yeah.
I don't know.
and that might be the problem.
Yeah.
The problem might not be our students, it might be the test.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Or our programs. It might not be our programs. It might be the test.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I'm happy to throw these questions under the bus as much as you want me to. I mean, there's much more work that we do, but as an historian, I will tell you these questions are not great.
Yeah. So there are no other questions in the chat box, but I want to take this time to thank you for a really well-informed presentation. This is extremely helpful for anybody who has to be looking at accreditation processes in the near future and thinking about how we use our assessment results to affect our curriculum and make curriculum and program changes. So thank you very much.